What would you do if you found the person you loved most in life begging on the street? Today's story will show how pride can destroy lives, but also how true love can survive the worst storms. Get ready for an emotional roller coaster. If you love stories that show the power of forgiveness, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Richard Thornfield stood in his corner office on the 45th floor of the Thornfield Tower, surveying the Chicago skyline that represented his technological empire. At 38, he controlled one of the world's largest software companies, with a personal fortune exceeding $8 billion. His penthouse apartment, private jets, and collection of luxury cars were symbols of a success built through ruthless intelligence and absolute control. But Richard's greatest pride wasn't his wealth. It was his reputation for never being wrong, never being deceived, and never allowing emotion to cloud his judgment. He had built his empire by reading people perfectly, anticipating their weaknesses, and exploiting their vulnerabilities before they could exploit his. Richard's world was one of absolute order and control. Every relationship was transactional, every decision was calculated, and every interaction was designed to maintain his position of dominance. He trusted no one completely, loved nothing unconditionally, and viewed emotional attachment as a liability that successful people couldn't afford. His office reflected his personality, stark, modern, and intimidating. Every piece of furniture was chosen for its psychological impact rather than comfort. The massive desk, the leather chairs positioned lower than his own, the intimidating wall of awards and achievements. Everything was designed to remind visitors that they were in the presence of superior intelligence and power. Richard's romantic history was a series of brief, calculated relationships with women who offered specific advantages, business connections, social status, or physical attraction. He had never experienced genuine love or vulnerability, viewing both as weaknesses that lesser men indulged in to their own detriment. But 3 years earlier, Richard had made what he considered the greatest mistake of his life. He had married Catherine Morrison, a woman who had somehow bypassed all his psychological defenses and made him believe in love. Catherine had been different from every other woman in Richard's circle. She worked as a social worker for Child Protective Services, dedicated her life to helping vulnerable families, and possessed an emotional intelligence that both fascinated and threatened Richard. She saw through his carefully constructed facade to the insecure boy beneath, and for 6 months she had made him believe he could be a better man. Their marriage had been intense, passionate, and ultimately explosive. Catherine had challenged Richard's worldview, questioned his business practices, and demanded emotional intimacy that terrified him. When she had secretly lent money to her sister's family without consulting him, Richard had felt betrayed in ways that triggered every defense mechanism he had ever built. The fight that ended their marriage had been vicious and final. Richard had accused Catherine of being like every other woman who wanted his money. Catherine had accused Richard of being incapable of genuine human connection. Both had said things that couldn't be taken back, wounds that couldn't be healed. The divorce had been swift and brutal. Richard's team of lawyers had ensured that Catherine received only the minimum required by law, despite the prenuptial agreement she had signed without reading. Richard had told himself that he was protecting his assets from a gold digger, but deep down he knew he was punishing Catherine for making him vulnerable. Across the city, in a world Richard could no longer imagine, Catherine Morrison was living. A reality that would have been unthinkable to her former self. At 32, she was homeless, hungry, and desperate, caring for a 2-year-old daughter while trying to survive on the streets of Chicago. Catherine's fall from middle-class stability to absolute poverty had been swift and devastating. After the divorce, she had discovered she was pregnant with Richard's child, but his lawyers had made it clear that any attempt to claim paternity or child support would result in legal warfare that would destroy her completely. Too proud to crawl. Back to a man who had called her a gold digger, Catherine had tried to rebuild her life independently. But pregnancy had made work difficult. Childbirth had drained her savings, and caring for an infant had made steady employment impossible. The social work degree that had once been her passion became worthless when background checks revealed her connection to Richard Thornfield and the circumstances of their divorce. Catherine's slide into homelessness had been gradual but inexorable. First, she had lost her apartment when maternity leave ended and her job was eliminated. Then she had exhausted the generosity of friends who couldn't afford to support 2 additional people long-term. Finally, she had swallowed her pride and applied for government assistance, only to discover that bureaucratic delays and system failures left her and Emily without support for months at a time. Now, Catherine lived with Emily in her car when she could afford gas, in shelters when beds were available, and on the streets when no other options existed. Every day was a struggle for basic survival, finding food, staying warm, keeping Emily safe and healthy despite circumstances that would challenge the strongest adults. But Catherine's greatest struggle wasn't physical, it was maintaining hope and dignity while feeling invisible to a world that had once valued her contributions. The confident social worker who had helped families in crisis had become one of the people she had once served, experiencing firsthand the systemic failures she had once fought to reform. Emily, now 2 years old, was a bright, curious child who had adapted to their nomadic lifestyle with the resilience that children possess. She drew pictures on napkins, made friends with other homeless children, and somehow maintained a sunny disposition despite never having known the security of a permanent home. Catherine's love for Emily was the only thing that kept her fighting when despair threatened to overwhelm her. Every sacrifice, every humiliation, every compromise with her former principles was justified by her daughter's needs. Emily deserved better than their current circumstances, but Catherine was trapped in a cycle of poverty that seemed impossible to escape. The irony that neither Richard nor Catherine yet understood was that they were about to encounter each other in circumstances that would force both to confront the consequences of their pride, the power of their love, and the possibility of redemption for mistakes that had seemed unforgivable. Richard's carefully controlled world was about to collide with the harsh reality of Catherine's desperation, and both their lives would be forever changed by a moment of recognition that would challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves and each other. It was a cold Tuesday in December when Richard's perfectly ordered life first cracked open to reveal the pain he had been hiding from himself for 3 years. He was leaving a lunch meeting at the Union Club, walking briskly toward his waiting car while talking on his phone about quarterly projections when the scene across the street stopped him mid-sentence. Under the awning of a closed restaurant, a young woman was sitting on the wet sidewalk with a small child in her lap. The woman was carefully dividing what appeared to be a single sandwich, giving the larger portion to the child, while keeping only a few bites for herself. Her movements were gentle and protective, shielding the child from the wind while ensuring the little one ate first. Richard had walked past homeless people thousands of times without truly seeing them. They were part of the urban landscape, invisible, obstacles to be navigated around rather than human beings deserving of attention. But something about this particular scene penetrated his usual indifference. Perhaps it was the woman's obvious devotion to her child, or the quiet dignity with which she handled their desperate circumstances. Perhaps it was the way she smiled at the little girl, despite their obvious poverty, or how she used her own body to shelter the child from the cold wind. Richard ended his phone call and stepped closer, drawn by a recognition he couldn't yet name. Imagine the shock, seeing the person you loved in this situation. The woman looked up at that moment, perhaps sensing his stare, and Richard felt the world tilt on its axis. Even with her hair matted and her face gaunt from hunger, even with clothes that had seen too many nights on the street, he knew that face as well as his own. Catherine. Catherine Morrison, his ex-wife, was sitting on a Chicago sidewalk feeding scraps to a child who could only be his daughter. Richard stood frozen, unable to process what he was seeing. The confident social worker who had challenged his worldview, who had walked away from their marriage with her head held high, was now begging for survival on the streets he owned. Catherine saw him at the same moment, and the recognition that passed between them was electric with pain, shame, and 3 years of unresolved emotion. She instinctively pulled the child closer, as if protecting her from Richard's gaze. The little girl, Emily, though Richard didn't yet know her name, looked up at him with the frank curiosity of a 2-year-old. Her eyes were unmistakably his, own, the same deep brown that looked back at him from mirrors. Her face was a feminine version of his own features, softened by Catherine's gentleness, but clearly bearing his genetic signature. Catherine. Richard's voice came out as barely a whisper. Catherine struggled to stand, hampered by exhaustion and the weight of the child in her arms. When she spoke, her voice carried the careful dignity of someone who had lost everything except their inner strength. "Hello, Richard." The simple greeting hit Richard like a physical blow. There was no anger in her voice, no plea for help, no dramatic emotion. Just the quiet acknowledgement of a woman who had nothing left to lose. "Is she—" Richard gestured. Toward Emily, unable to finish the question, Catherine's chin lifted slightly, and Richard saw a flash of the stubborn pride that had first attracted and ultimately destroyed their marriage. "She's my daughter." "Our daughter." Catherine was quiet for a moment, and Richard could see her weighing her words carefully. "She's 2 years and 3 months old. You can do the math." Richard felt his legs go weak. Emily had been conceived during the last weeks of their marriage, before the final explosion that had torn them apart. Catherine had been carrying his child when he had thrown her out of his life with such vicious finality. "Why didn't you tell me?" Catherine's laugh was bitter, but not cruel. "Tell you what? That the gold digger you divorced was trying to trap you with a pregnancy? That the woman you accused of only wanting your money was about to become a single mother? You would have what, Richard? Accused me of deliberately getting pregnant to secure child support. Demanded a DNA test to make sure it was really yours. Insisted on a custody arrangement that would let you control my life forever." Richard had no answer because he knew she was right. In his anger and pride, he would have seen Catherine's pregnancy as confirmation of his worst suspicions about her motives. "How long have you been—" Richard gestured helplessly at their surroundings. "Homeless? About 8 months? Struggling? Since the day you divorced me." Emily began to fuss, tired and cold and confused by the tension between the adults. Catherine immediately focused all her attention on comforting her daughter, whispering soft words and rocking her gently. "Mama, I'm cold," Emily said in a small voice. "I know, sweetheart. We'll find somewhere warm soon." Richard watched Catherine comfort their daughter with skills that spoke of months of practice managing crisis situations. This wasn't a temporary setback. This was their life. "Catherine, let me help. Let me get you somewhere warm. Get Emily some food." "We don't need your help," Catherine said automatically, the reflexive pride of someone who had been rejected too many times to accept. "Charity easily. She's my daughter too." Catherine looked at him with eyes that had seen too much pain. "Now she's your daughter. She's been your daughter for 2 years, Richard. Where have you been?" "I didn't know." Because you made sure not to know, because you cut off every way I might have contacted you, because you made it clear that I was dead to you. Richard felt the weight of his own choices pressing down on him. Every legal maneuver designed to protect him from Catherine had also protected him from knowing about Emily. Every barrier erected to keep his ex-wife out of his life had also kept his daughter out of his life. "Please," Richard said, and the word felt foreign on his tongue. He couldn't remember the last time he had begged anyone for anything. "Let me get you both somewhere safe. Then we can figure out what happens next." Catherine studied his face, searching for signs of the manipulation and control that had characterized their marriage. But what she saw was something she had never seen in Richard before, genuine vulnerability and what looked like regret. "One night," she said finally. "A hotel room for Emily to get warm and clean, nothing more. And tomorrow we go back to our lives." "Our lives? Your life of money and power, my life of survival and poverty." Richard nodded, knowing he had no right to demand more. But as he helped Catherine and Emily into his car, he made a silent vow that this would not be just one night. Somehow, he was going to find a way to repair the damage his pride had caused. The ride to the hotel was mostly silent, but Richard found himself stealing glances at Emily in the rearview mirror. His daughter, the word still felt impossible, was alert and curious, despite her obvious exhaustion, taking in the luxury of the car with wide eyes. "Mama, this car is really fancy," Emily observed. "Yes, it is," Catherine replied carefully. "Is the man rich?" Richard felt his heart break at the innocent question. His daughter's only frame of reference for wealth was whether someone could afford a car. "Yes," Catherine said simply. "He's very rich. Is he nice?" Catherine met Richard's eyes in the mirror, and for a moment the years of anger and hurt fell away. "I don't know, sweetheart. We'll have to see." Richard took Catherine and Emily to the Peninsula Hotel, one of Chicago's most exclusive establishments. As they walked through the marble lobby with its crystal chandeliers and impeccably dressed staff, the contrast between their worlds became painfully obvious. Catherine, despite her circumstances, carried herself with dignity, but her worn clothes and tired appearance drew stares from other guests. Emily clung to her mother's hand, overwhelmed by the opulence surrounding them. Richard felt the judging eyes of the hotel staff and guests, and for the first time in his adult life, he was embarrassed by the shallow prejudices of his social class rather than by association with someone outside it. "Mr. Thornfield," the desk clerk said with professional courtesy, "your usual suite is available." "Actually, I need 2 rooms," Richard corrected. "A family suite with separate bedrooms." As they rode the elevator to the top floor, Emily's excitement about the mirrors and buttons temporarily broke the tension. "Mama, look, I can see myself everywhere." Catherine smiled, and Richard caught a glimpse of the woman he had fallen in love with. Warm, generous, completely focused on making someone else happy despite her own pain. The suite was enormous by any standard, but after months of homelessness, it must have seemed like a palace to Catherine and Emily. Emily ran immediately to the floor-to-ceiling windows, pressing her face against the glass to see the city lights below. "Mama, we're so high up, look at all the tiny cars." Catherine followed her daughter to the window, and Richard watched them both taking in the view of Chicago spread out beneath them. The irony wasn't lost on him. This was his city, his skyline, representing an empire built while his own family lived in poverty on its streets. "There's a bathroom through there," Richard said awkwardly, gesturing toward one of the suite's marble bathrooms. "And room service can bring whatever you need." Catherine turned to face him, and Richard was struck by how much weight she had lost, how exhaustion had carved lines around her eyes that hadn't been there during their marriage. "Why are you doing this, Richard?" "Because she's my daughter." "You've had a daughter for 2 years. That didn't motivate you to find us before." "Because I didn't know." Because you didn't want to know, Catherine interrupted. There's a difference. Richard wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the accusation was too close to the truth. He had constructed his life after their divorce to eliminate any possibility of contact with Catherine, telling himself it was necessary for his emotional well-being. "You're right," he admitted. "I was protecting myself from any reminder of our marriage. I didn't consider that I might also be protecting myself from my own child." Catherine was surprised by his admission. The Richard she remembered never acknowledged fault, never admitted weakness. "What's changed?" she asked. Richard looked at Emily, who was now examining the suite's entertainment system with the intense focus that reminded him of his own childhood. "Fascination with technology. Everything," he said simply. "Seeing her, seeing you both like this, it changes everything." Over the next few hours, Richard observed Catherine and Emily navigating the luxury suite with a mixture of wonder and careful restraint. Emily was delighted by the deep bathtub, the soft robes, and the room service dinner that arrived with more food than she had probably seen in weeks. But Catherine remained guarded, protective, clearly waiting for the conditions and expectations that would surely accompany Richard's generosity. "What do you want from us?" Catherine asked when Emily had finally fallen asleep in the suite's second bedroom. "I want to know my daughter. I want to make sure you both have what you need." "And what do you want from me personally?" Richard considered the question carefully. "I want to understand how we got here. I want to know how the woman I married ended up homeless while I continued building my empire." "That's easy to answer. You threw me out of your life and I was too proud to fight for a place in it. There has to be more to it than that." Catherine walked to the window, looking out at the city lights that seemed both beautiful and hostile. "Do you really want to know? Do you want to hear about what happened after you decided I was nothing more than a gold digger?" "Yes." Catherine was quiet for several minutes, gathering the emotional strength to revisit the worst period of her life. "I found out I was pregnant 2 weeks after our divorce was finalized," she began. "I was working at the Family Services Agency, trying to put my life back together when the morning sickness started." Richard felt his stomach clench, imagining Catherine dealing with pregnancy alone, while he was congratulating himself on escaping their marriage. "I thought about contacting you, but your lawyers had made it very clear that any communication would be considered harassment. And honestly, I was still so angry about the things you said during our divorce that I didn't want to give you another chance to reject me. So you handled the pregnancy alone." "I tried to, but pregnancy complications forced me to take medical leave from work, and my position was eliminated while I was out. The social work field is small, and word had gotten around about my connection to you and the circumstances of our divorce." "What do you mean?" Catherine turned to face him, and Richard saw pain that went beyond physical hardship. "No one would hire me. Every background check revealed my marriage to you and the very public nature of our divorce. Employers assumed I was either unstable or looking for a wealthy husband among their clients. My professional reputation was destroyed by association with you." Richard felt the foundation of his self-righteousness beginning to crumble. "I had no idea." "Of course you didn't. You were insulated from the consequences of your actions by wealth and power. I was living with those consequences every day." "What about government assistance, social services?" Catherine laughed bitterly. "You mean the system I used to work for? The system that's designed to help people like I used to be, not people like I became. Even with my professional knowledge, it took months to navigate the bureaucracy. By then, I had lost my apartment, exhausted my savings, and given birth to Emily in a public hospital." Richard tried to imagine Catherine, alone and frightened, giving birth to their daughter without any support system. "Where did you go after Emily was born?" "A friend let us stay with her for a few months, but she couldn't afford to support us long term. I tried to work part-time jobs, but childcare costs more than minimum wage pays. I tried to work nights, but Emily was colicky and needed constant attention. And your family? My family was ashamed of me. They said I had brought disgrace on the family name by marrying above my station and then getting divorced so publicly. They blamed me for not being smart enough to secure a better settlement, for not playing the game the way other women would have. Richard realized that Catherine had been trapped between two impossible positions. His world, which had rejected her as a gold digger, and her own world, which had rejected her as a failure. How did you end up on the streets? Gradually then, suddenly. Each solution was temporary, each safety net had holes. Each time I thought we had found stability, something would go wrong. Emily would get sick, or I would lose a job, or the car would break down. Eventually, there were no more friends to call, no more favors to ask, no more options except the streets. Catherine's voice remained calm and factual throughout her recitation, but Richard could see the emotional toll of reliving those experiences. And Emily? How has she handled all this? Catherine's expression softened as she looked toward the bedroom where their daughter was sleeping. She's remarkable. She adapts to anything, finds joy in the smallest things, makes friends wherever we go. She doesn't know that our life isn't normal. This is the only life she's ever known. What does she know about me? Nothing. How do you explain to a 2-year-old that her father exists but doesn't want her? The words hit Richard like a physical blow. I did want her. I just didn't know. What you knew or didn't know doesn't change her experience. What it doesn't change is that she's grown up without a father because her parents were too proud and too hurt to find a way past their anger. Richard sank into one of the suite's leather chairs, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his own blindness and cruelty. Catherine, I'm sorry. I'm so incredibly sorry for all of it. Sorry doesn't change the past 2 years. No, but maybe it can change the next 2 years. And the next 20 years. Catherine studied his face, searching for sincerity. Or calculation. What are you saying? I'm saying I want to be part of Emily's life. I want to make sure you both have stability, security, a future that isn't about survival. And what do you want from me in return? Richard met her eyes directly. Nothing. I want to support Emily because she's my daughter. I want to help you because you're her mother, and because I owe you a debt I can never fully repay. You don't believe in something for nothing. There's always a price with you. Maybe there was before. But seeing my daughter living on the streets changes a man's perspective on what's really valuable. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, and Richard could see her weighing his words against her experience of his character. I need time to think about this, she said finally. Of course. Stay here as long as you need. We don't have to decide anything tonight. But as Richard prepared to leave the suite and return to his own penthouse, he knew that everything had already been decided. He was going to fight for a place in Emily's life, and if that meant swallowing his pride and begging Catherine's forgiveness, then that's what he would do. The only question was whether Catherine would ever be able to trust him again after the damage his pride had caused. The next morning, Richard arrived at the hotel suite early, bringing breakfast and a carefully chosen selection of children's clothes for Emily. He found Catherine and Emily on the suite's balcony, sharing orange juice and watching the city wake up below them. "Mama, is this where we live now?" Emily asked as Richard joined them. "No, sweetheart, this is just for a few days. Can we stay longer? I like the big bathtub." Richard felt his heart break at his daughter's simple pleasure in basic comforts. "You can stay as long as you want," he said before Catherine could respond. Catherine shot him a warning look. "Richard, we talked about this. I know. But Emily should have choices about where she sleeps and what she eats. She shouldn't have to worry about whether there will be a roof over her head." Over breakfast, Richard watched Emily interact with the world around her. She was curious about everything, asking thoughtful questions and making observations that revealed intelligence far beyond her years. "Why do some people have lots of food and other people have no food?" Emily asked, apparently thinking about their situation. Catherine and Richard exchanged glances, both struggling with how to answer such a profound question from a 2-year-old. "Sometimes life isn't fair," Catherine said carefully. "Sometimes people don't get the same chances, but couldn't people with lots of food share with people who don't have food?" "Some people do share," Richard said, "and some people don't think about sharing." "Which kind of person are you?" Emily asked with the directness that only children possess. Richard felt the question like a challenge to his entire worldview. "I'm learning to be the kind of person who shares." After breakfast, while Emily was absorbed in colouring books Richard had brought, Catherine confronted him about his real intentions. "You can't just buy your way into her life," Catherine said quietly. "Love and trust aren't things you can purchase with hotel suites and expensive gifts." "I know that. Do you? Because everything you've done so far has been about money and control. The expensive hotel, the designer clothes, the promise that she can stay as long as she wants. It's all about using your wealth to create the outcome you want." Richard felt defensive, but recognized the truth in Catherine's accusation. "What else can I do? I can't undo the past 2 years. I can't give you back the time and opportunities my selfishness cost you. All I can do is try to make the future better. Emily doesn't need a wealthy stranger trying to buy her affection. She needs a father who will be present consistently, who will put her needs above his own comfort, who will love her even when it's inconvenient. I want to be that father. Wanting and being are different things. You've never had to sacrifice anything for anyone else. You've never had to put someone else's needs above your own desires. How do I know you won't disappear?" Again, the first time being a father becomes difficult. Richard wanted to argue, to defend himself, but Catherine's questions cut to the heart of his character in ways that made him uncomfortable. "You don't know," he admitted. "I don't know either. But I want the chance to prove that I can change." "At whose risk? Emily's? She's already lived without a father for 2 years. If you commit to being in her life and then decide it's too hard, she'll be devastated. And if I don't try, she'll never know her father at all." Catherine was quiet for a moment, watching Emily colour with intense concentration. "There's something else you need to know," Catherine said finally. "Something I should have told you last night." Richard felt his stomach clench. "What?" Catherine walked to her purse and pulled out a manila envelope. "Legal documents. Custody. Papers." "Custody papers? I filed them 6 months ago when I realized we were going to end up on the streets. I wanted to make sure Emily had legal protection if something happened to me." Richard's blood ran cold. "What kind of legal protection?" "I named my sister as Emily's guardian in case of my death or incapacitation, but I also filed for full legal custody and requested that you be required to pay child support." "What happened?" "Your lawyers happened. They filed counter motions claiming I was an unfit mother because of my homelessness. They demanded DNA testing, psychological evaluations, and full investigation of my finances and living situation." Richard felt sick. "I didn't know about any of this." "Of course you didn't. Your lawyers handled these things without bothering you with details, but they made it very clear that if I pursued child support, they would fight for full custody and claim Emily would be better off in your care than mine. So you dropped the case?" "I couldn't risk losing her. Even living on the streets was better than losing my daughter to a man who had never acknowledged her existence." Richard sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the revelation that he had been inadvertently waging legal war against his own family. "Catherine, I swear to you, I had no idea any of this was happening." "I believe you, but that's the problem. You live in such a protected bubble that you don't know what's done in your name. Your lawyers, your security team, your public relations. People, they all work to keep unpleasant realities away from you. What can I do to fix this? I don't know if it can be fixed. The legal system sees me as an unfit mother because I'm homeless. But I'm homeless partly because your divorce left me with no resources, and your lawyers made sure I couldn't access child support. Richard felt the weight of systemic injustice that he had been blind to his entire life. There has to be a way. Maybe. But it would require you to acknowledge Emily publicly, to admit that you have a daughter you've ignored for 2 years, to accept responsibility for the circumstances that led to our homelessness. I'll do whatever it takes. Catherine studied his face carefully, even if it means admitting you were wrong. Even if it means your business associates and social circle judge you for having a homeless ex-wife and daughter, even then. Even if it means restructuring your entire life around Emily's needs rather than your own convenience. Yes, Catherine was quiet for several minutes, and Richard could see her wrestling with a decision that would affect all their lives. "There's something else," she said finally. "Something that might change how you feel about all this." "What?" Catherine took a deep breath, as if gathering courage for a confession that would change everything. "Emily isn't just your daughter, because we were married when she was conceived. She's your daughter, because you're the only man I was with during that entire period of our relationship." Richard looked confused. "I don't understand." "What I'm saying is that there's no doubt about paternity. Emily is definitely your biological child, but that's not the revelation." "Then what is?" Catherine met his eyes directly. "The revelation is that I knew I was pregnant before our final fight. I knew, and I didn't tell you." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. "You knew?" "I had just gotten the test results that morning. I was planning to tell you that evening, to share the news and talk about how we wanted to handle parenthood. But then we had the fight about the money. And you said such horrible things about my motives for marrying you, accused me of being a gold digger who was trying to trap you. How could I tell you I was pregnant after that? You would have seen it as confirmation of every terrible thing you believed about me." Richard felt the room spinning around him. "So you let me divorce you while you were carrying my child?" "I let you divorce me because I couldn't bear to be married to someone who thought so little of me. The pregnancy just made it more complicated." "Why? Didn't you tell me afterward, when you were struggling, when you needed help?" "Because I was angry and hurt and proud. Because I wanted to prove I could raise our daughter without your money or your help. Because I thought you would either reject us both or try to take Emily away from me." Richard buried his face in his hands, overwhelmed by the magnitude of misunderstandings and missed opportunities that had led to their current situation. "Catherine, if you had known, what would you have done? Stayed married to a woman you didn't trust, fought for custody of a child you didn't want, supported us financially while resenting us emotionally?" "I don't know. But I would have had the chance to do the right thing, and I would have had the chance to be supported during the most difficult period of my life instead of facing it alone. The twist no one expected." They sat in silence for several minutes, both processing the weight of revelations that reframed their entire shared history. "Emily," Catherine called softly, "can you come here for a minute?" Emily approached them with her coloring book, sensing the serious tone of the conversation. "Emily," Catherine said gently, "do you remember how I told you that some children have daddies who live with them, and some have daddies who live far away?" "Yes. Well, this is Richard, and Richard is your daddy." Emily looked between Catherine and Richard with the careful attention of a child trying to understand adult complexities. "My daddy?" "Yes, sweetheart." Emily studied Richard's face intently. "Are you going to live with us now?" The question hung in the air, loaded with implications that none of them were ready to address. "I'd like to spend time with you," Richard said carefully. "I'd like to get to know you and be part of your life. Will you read me stories, if you'd like me to? Will you help Mama find us a house?" Richard felt his heart break at the simple request. "Yes, I'll help Mama find you a house." Emily seemed satisfied with his answers and returned to her coloring, but Richard and Catherine both understood that their daughter's innocent questions had just committed them to figuring out a future that seemed impossible to navigate. "So what happens now?" Richard asked. "Now we try to put our daughter's needs above our own pride and anger," Catherine said. "Now we figure out how to be parents together, even though we couldn't figure out how to be married together. Can you forgive me for all of it?" Catherine looked at him with eyes that had seen too much pain, but still held traces of the love that had brought them together. "I don't know. Forgiveness isn't a decision, it's a process, but I'm willing to try for Emily's sake." Richard nodded, knowing he had no right to ask for more. But as he watched Emily color a picture of a family standing in front of a house, he made a silent vow that he would spend the rest of his life earning the forgiveness and trust that his pride had cost them all. The revelation about Catherine's pregnancy knowledge and Richard's unwitting legal warfare against his own family created a period of intense emotional reckoning for both of them. The hotel suite became a temporary sanctuary where they were forced to confront the full scope of damage their pride and poor communication had caused. For Richard, the consequences of his actions were overwhelming and immediate. He learned that, while he had been congratulating himself on moving past their failed marriage, Catherine had been fighting legal battles with his own attorneys, struggling through pregnancy alone, and ultimately becoming homeless, partly due to systems he had put in place to protect himself from her. The night after Catherine's revelations, Richard couldn't sleep. He paced his penthouse apartment, haunted by images of Catherine giving birth alone, of Emily's first steps taken in poverty, of Christmas mornings spent in homeless shelters while he enjoyed luxury that could have solved all their problems with pocket change. Richard called his head of legal affairs, James Morrison, at 3 a.m., demanding an immediate explanation of any legal actions taken against Catherine Morrison in the past 2 years. "Sir, we've handled several nuisance cases involving your ex-wife," Morrison said groggily. "Attempted child support claims, harassment allegations, typical post-divorce complications. We've successfully defended against all of them." Defended? Against what exactly? Claims that you fathered a child with her. We've maintained that without DNA evidence, and given her obvious financial desperation, any such claims were attempts at extortion. Richard felt physically sick. "Did it ever occur to you to ask me whether I had fathered a child with my ex-wife?" "Sir, you made it very clear after your divorce that you wanted no contact with Ms. Morrison under any circumstances. We were following your explicit instructions to handle any legal issues without involving you." "By denying the existence of my daughter." There was a long pause. "Your daughter, sir?" "I met her yesterday. Emily is 2 years old. She's definitely mine, and she's been living on the streets while you've been fighting her mother's attempts to secure child support." Richard could hear the panic in Morrison's voice as the lawyer realized the magnitude of the legal and public relations nightmare he had created. "Sir, we had no way of knowing." "You had every way of knowing. You could have asked me. You could have required DNA testing instead of simply denying paternity. You could have investigated the facts instead of assuming my ex-wife was lying." Richard hung up and immediately called an emergency meeting with his entire legal team. By 6 a.m., he was sitting in his conference room demanding explanations for 3 years of legal strategies that had systematically destroyed his own family. "We have records of 17 different attempts by Ms. Morrison to establish contact or request support," his junior attorney reported nervously. Our responses were uniformly negative, claiming no legal obligation and threatening harassment charges for continued contact. "Show me," Richard demanded. The files they presented painted a devastating picture of Catherine's attempts to reach him through proper legal channels. Each one met with increasingly aggressive legal responses designed to intimidate her into silence. There were letters requesting child support, medical emergency notifications when Emily was hospitalized with pneumonia. Even a simple Christmas card with Emily's picture that had been returned by Richard's security team as unwanted correspondence. "You returned a Christmas card from my daughter." Richard's voice was deadly quiet. "Sir, you had a standing order that all correspondence from Ms. Morrison was to be blocked. Did you look at the picture? Did you see the child who obviously shares my DNA?" The legal team exchanged nervous glances. None of them had ever seen the actual correspondence. They had simply processed it according to Richard's blanket instructions. "Fire them," Richard said suddenly. "Sir, all of you, you're fired. Every attorney who participated in denying my daughter's existence, every staff member who returned her letters, every person who helped keep my own family away from me. Clean out your offices and leave." The purge of his legal team was swift and brutal, but it was only the beginning of Richard's self-imposed punishment. He began systematically reviewing every aspect of his business and personal life, looking for other areas where his emotional blindness had caused harm. Meanwhile, Catherine was experiencing her own form of punishment, the torture of hope mixed with deep skepticism about Richard's capacity for genuine change. She had lived through his promises before, had believed in his potential for growth during their marriage, only to discover that his pride and need for control ultimately mattered more to him than their relationship. "Mama, why are you sad?" Emily asked one morning as they ate breakfast in the hotel suite. "I'm not sad, sweetheart. I'm just thinking about grown-up things." "Are you thinking about Daddy Richard?" Catherine was startled by Emily's intuitive understanding. "Why do you call him that?" "Because you said he's my daddy, and his name is Richard. So he's Daddy Richard. What do you think about Daddy Richard?" Emily considered the question with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. "I think he's sad too. He has sad eyes like you do." Catherine realized that Emily, with a child's clarity, had identified something Catherine had been trying to ignore. Richard was genuinely suffering from the discovery of what his actions had cost them all. But suffering wasn't the same as changing, and Catherine had learned to be skeptical of Richard's emotional displays. During their marriage, he had been capable of intense remorse when confronted with the consequences of his behavior, but the remorse never lasted long enough to create permanent change. "Emily," Catherine said carefully, "how would you feel if Daddy Richard wanted to spend more time with us? Like every day? Maybe not every day, but more often than just these few days in the hotel." Emily's face lit up. "Would we have our own house then, with my own room and toys that we don't have to carry?" Catherine felt her heart break at her daughter's simple desires. A permanent home, personal possessions, the security that other children took for granted. "Maybe, sweetheart, but it's complicated." "Why is it complicated? How do you explain to a 2-year-old that her parents' relationship is built on a foundation of mutual hurt and mistrust? That love isn't always enough to overcome fundamental incompatibilities, that even good intentions can be undermined by deep-seated character flaws. Because grown-ups sometimes have trouble figuring out how to live together nicely," Catherine said finally, "like when kids fight on the playground? Something like that. But then they say sorry and play together again. Sometimes they do, but sometimes the hurt is too big for sorry to fix." Emily absorbed this information with the philosophical acceptance that children show when adults fail to make sense. That afternoon, Richard returned to the hotel suite with a proposal that both thrilled and terrified Catherine. "I've fired my entire legal team," he announced. "I've hired new attorneys whose first job is to resolve all the legal barriers to Emily's paternity recognition and your access to support. Richard, I've also purchased a house. Nothing ostentatious, just a 4-bedroom home in Lincoln Park with a good school district and a backyard where Emily can play safely." Catherine felt overwhelmed by the speed of his decisions. "You can't just buy your way to a solution. I'm not trying to buy a solution. I'm trying to remove the financial barriers that have kept us apart and create space for us to figure out what kind of relationship is possible." "What kind of relationship do you want?" Richard looked at Emily, who was building an elaborate tower with blocks he had brought her that morning. "I want to be Emily's father in every way that matters. I want to support both of you in whatever way you'll allow. And I want the chance to prove that I can be the man you thought you were marrying. And if you can't, if being a father is harder than you expected, if living up to your promises requires more sacrifice than you're prepared to make, then I'll have to live with the consequences of my failures. But at least Emily will have had the experience of a father who tried, rather than a father who disappeared." Catherine studied his face, searching for signs of the calculated manipulation she had learned to recognize during their marriage. But what she saw was something new: vulnerability mixed with determination, humility mixed with hope. "There are conditions," she said finally. "Name them. First, this isn't about us getting back together. This is about you building a relationship with Emily while I decide whether I can trust you again. Understood? Second, you don't get to make unilateral decisions about Emily's life. We discuss everything: schools, activities, medical care, everything." "Agreed." "Third, if you decide this is too difficult and want to walk away, you do it cleanly and permanently. You don't get to drift in and out of her life when it's convenient for you." Richard felt the weight of the commitment he was making. "I understand." "And fourth, you prove your commitment through consistency over time, not through grand gestures and expensive gifts." "How long?" "However long it takes for me to believe that your change is real and permanent." Richard nodded, knowing he had no right to demand a timeline for forgiveness. But as they began the process of becoming a family, both Richard and Catherine understood that the real test was yet to come. It was one thing to make promises in a luxury hotel suite while emotions were running high. It was another thing to maintain those commitments through the daily challenges of co-parenting, financial negotiations, and the slow rebuilding of trust that had been shattered by years of mutual hurt. The consequences of their failed marriage had been devastating for all three of them. The question now was whether the promise of redemption would be strong enough to overcome the legacy of their shared mistakes. But first, they would all have to survive the punishment phase, the period where good intentions would be tested against old patterns, where Emily's needs would compete with their own emotional comfort, and where the gap between who they wanted to be and who they actually were would be revealed through the crucible of daily interaction. Neither Richard nor Catherine fully understood yet how much they would both have to change to make their new arrangement work. But Emily, with a child's faith in the possibility of happy endings, was already planning the decorations for her new bedroom and asking whether Daddy Richard knew how to push swings at playgrounds. The real work was just beginning. The first 6 months of Richard's attempt to become a real father to Emily were the most humbling and transformative period of his adult life. Moving from the theoretical commitment made in a hotel suite to the daily reality of being responsible for a child's well-being forced Richard to confront every aspect of his character that had made him a successful businessman, but a failure as a husband and father. Richard's first shock came when Catherine accepted his offer of the Lincoln Park house, but insisted on paying rent from her eventual income rather than accepting it as charity. Her pride, which he had once seen as stubbornness, now revealed itself as a deep need for independence that he had to respect rather than override. "I'm not your kept woman, and Emily isn't your purchased daughter," Catherine explained as they walked through the house together. "If we're going to live here, it has to be because we're building something together, not because you're rescuing us from poverty." Richard's instinct was to argue that money shouldn't matter between them, but he was learning to listen to Catherine's perspective rather than dismissing it. Her insistence on contributing financially wasn't about pride. It was about maintaining the equality that their marriage had lacked. The house itself became a laboratory for learning how to be a family. Emily's delight in having her own room, her own bed, and her own toys was infectious, but it also highlighted how much of normal childhood she had missed during their months of homelessness. "She hoards food," Catherine explained to Richard after finding crackers hidden under Emily's mattress. "She's not hungry anymore, but she still panics about not having enough. It's going to take time for her to trust that food will always be available." Richard watched Emily carefully portion out her snacks, saving half for later even when more food was readily available, and realized that poverty had left psychological scars that money couldn't immediately heal. His own learning curve was steep and often embarrassing. Richard had never changed a diaper, prepared a meal for a child, or navigated a playground social dynamic. Emily's patience with his incompetence was both touching and humbling. "Daddy Richard, you're putting my shirt on backwards," Emily informed him matter-of-factly during one of his first attempts at helping her get dressed. "How can you tell?" "Because the picture goes in front and you put it in back." Richard looked down at the shirt featuring cartoon dinosaurs that were indeed facing the wrong direction and felt a mixture of embarrassment and affection. Emily's gentle correction carried no judgment, only the matter-of-fact instruction of someone used to helping confused adults. But the most profound aspect of Richard's transformation wasn't learning practical parenting skills. It was discovering that love for Emily required him to become a different kind of person entirely. His business success had been built on control, intimidation, and emotional detachment, but Emily responded only to patience, gentleness, and genuine emotional availability. "Why don't you smile very much?" Emily asked him one evening as he read her a bedtime story. "I smile," Richard protested. "Not really. You make your mouth go up, but your eyes stay sad." Richard was amazed by his daughter's emotional intelligence. At 2 years old, she could read his expressions more accurately than business associates who had known him for years. "How do I make my eyes happy?" he asked seriously. Emily considered the question with her characteristic thoughtfulness. "You have to think about things that make you really, really happy inside. What makes you really, really happy? When Mama laughs, when you read me stories, when we all eat dinner together and no one is sad." Richard realized that Emily's happiness was entirely relational. She found joy in connection, in shared experiences, in the emotional well-being of the people she loved. It was a completely different value system from the achievement-based happiness he had pursued his entire adult life. That night, after Emily was asleep, Richard found Catherine in the kitchen, preparing her work clothes for the next day. She had started working as a victim advocate at a domestic violence shelter, using her social work background and personal experience with systemic failure to help other women navigate crisis situations. "She's incredible," Richard said, joining Catherine at the table where she was reviewing case files. "She is, but she's also damaged in ways that aren't obvious. Did you notice how she checks on both of us constantly? How she mediates when she senses tension between us?" Richard had noticed Emily's hyper-awareness of adult emotions, her tendency to become anxious when voices were raised, her efforts to make peace when she sensed conflict. She's learned to be responsible for adult emotions because her survival Depended on keeping me stable during our worst periods, Catherine explained. She shouldn't have to carry that burden. How do we help her feel safe enough to just be a child? Consistency, predictability, proof over time that the adults in her life can handle their own emotions without her management. Richard was learning that repairing the damage from Emily's first 2 years would require more than providing material security. It would require both parents to become emotionally healthy enough to give Emily permission to be age-appropriately dependent. His transformation accelerated when Emily started preschool and Richard volunteered to handle pickup duties. Interacting with other parents in the school parking lot exposed him to perspectives on parenting and priorities that challenged every assumption he had made about what children needed. "Your daughter is so mature," commented Sarah Chen, whose son was in Emily's class. "She takes care of the other kids when they're upset. Is that good or bad?" Richard asked, genuinely uncertain. "It's concerning. 3-year-olds should be focused on their own needs, not managing other people's emotions. Has she experienced trauma?" Richard found himself explaining Emily's history to a virtual stranger, and Sarah's compassionate response taught him that Emily's early experiences weren't something to hide, but something that required understanding and support. "There are therapists who specialize in helping children recover from homelessness and poverty," Sarah suggested. "The trauma is real, but it's absolutely treatable." That conversation led to Richard and Catherine finding a family therapist who helped them understand how Emily's early experiences had shaped her development and what they could do to help her heal. Emily has learned to be hyper-vigilant about adult emotions because her safety depended on predicting and managing your stress levels, Dr. Amanda Foster explained during their first session. She needs to learn that she's safe to have her own emotions without worrying about how they affect you. The therapy sessions were revelatory for Richard. He learned that his own emotional unavailability during Catherine's pregnancy and Emily's early years had created trauma not just through absence, but through the instability his absence had caused in Catherine's ability to provide consistent care. Children need to know that their parents can handle life's challenges without falling apart, Dr. Foster explained. When a parent is overwhelmed by circumstances beyond their control, children often try to become helpers instead of allowing themselves to be helped. Richard realized that healing Emily would require healing himself and his relationship with Catherine. They needed to become stable, emotionally available co-parents who could handle conflict without dragging Emily into adult drama. This realization led to individual therapy for Richard, where he began to understand how his own childhood experiences with emotionally unavailable parents had shaped his fear of vulnerability and his need for control. "You learned early that emotions were dangerous and that love was conditional on performance," his therapist, Dr. Michael Green, observed. "Those survival strategies served you well in business, but made intimate relationships impossible. How do I change patterns that have defined my entire adult life? The same way you became successful in business, through consistent practice and willingness to fail and try again." Richard's business suffered during this period of intense personal work. He missed important meetings to attend Emily's preschool performances, turned down profitable deals that would have required extensive travel, and restructured his entire schedule around Emily's needs. "You're destroying everything we've built," his business partner David Sterling warned during a tense board meeting. "Your productivity has dropped by half, you're unavailable for critical decisions, and you're prioritizing personal matters over business obligations." "Good," Richard replied. "Maybe it's time to build something that allows room for human relationships instead of demanding their sacrifice. This is temporary insanity. You'll come to your senses and regret dismantling your empire for a child you barely know." Richard looked at David, a man who had sacrificed 3 marriages and relationships with his own children for business success. and saw his own future if he didn't continue changing. I'd rather be a present father with a smaller company than an absent father with a larger one, Richard said firmly. 6 months into their new arrangement, Catherine began to see changes in Richard that went beyond surface-level adjustments. He was learning to listen without defending, to apologize without making excuses, and to put Emily's needs above his own comfort even when it was inconvenient. The transformation was tested during Emily's first major illness since they had moved into the house. She contracted a severe case of flu that required round-the-clock care for 5 days. Richard cancelled all business obligations and took turns with Catherine monitoring Emily's fever, administering medications, and providing comfort. "You don't have to stay," Catherine told him during the 3rd sleepless night. "I can handle this alone. I've done it before." "I know you can handle it alone," Richard replied, gently placing a cool cloth on Emily's forehead. "But you shouldn't have to, and I don't want to miss being here when she needs both her parents." Catherine watched Richard comfort their feverish daughter with a tenderness she had never seen from him before, and felt something shift in her own heart. This wasn't the man who had thrown her out of his life during their marriage. This was someone new, someone who had learned to love beyond his own self-interest. When Emily finally recovered, her first words were, "Daddy Richard, you stayed the whole time." "Of course I stayed. That's what daddies do when their little girls are sick." "Some daddies go away when things are hard," Emily said, with the wisdom of a child who had learned not to expect too much from adults. "This daddy isn't going anywhere." Richard promised. Catherine saw Emily's face light up with joy and security, and realized that Richard's transformation might actually be permanent. He wasn't just playing a role or making temporary adjustments. He was becoming a different person entirely, but the ultimate test of his redemption was yet to come. A year after their reunion, Richard and Catherine had successfully co-parented Emily through preschool, numerous childhood illnesses, and the complex process of helping her heal from early trauma. But their own relationship remained carefully cordial, focused entirely on Emily's needs while avoiding the deeper emotional territory that had once connected and ultimately destroyed them. Emily, now 3.5, had blossomed in the stability of their arrangement. She was confident, curious, and age-appropriately dependent on both parents. The hypervigilance and premature maturity that had marked her first years were gradually giving way to normal childhood behavior. But Emily had also begun asking questions that pushed Richard and Catherine toward conversations they had been avoiding. "Why don't you and Daddy Richard sleep in the same room, like Tommy's parents?" Emily asked Catherine one morning as they prepared breakfast together. "Because Daddy, Richard and I are divorced. That means we're not married anymore, but we both love you and take care of you. But you're friends now, right?" Catherine considered the question. Were they friends? They worked together effectively as co-parents, treated each other with respect and courtesy, and had developed an easy rhythm of shared responsibilities, but friendship implied something deeper than their careful coexistence. "We're learning to be friends," Catherine said carefully. "Could you be married again if you wanted to?" "It's complicated, sweetheart. Everything is complicated with grown-ups," Emily observed with a sigh that made Catherine laugh despite the weight of the conversation. That evening, Catherine found Richard on the back deck, watching Emily play. In the sandbox he had built for her, it was a peaceful domestic scene that felt simultaneously natural and impossible. "She asked me today why we don't sleep in the same room," Catherine said, joining him on the deck. Richard was quiet for a moment. "What did you tell her?" "That we're divorced but learning to be friends." "Are we? Learning to be friends?" Catherine studied Richard's profile in the fading light. Over the past year, she had watched him transform from the controlling, emotionally unavailable man she had divorced into someone patient, thoughtful, and genuinely committed to their daughter's well-being. I think we might be learning to be more than friends, Catherine admitted. Richard turned to look at her, surprised by her honesty. What do you mean? I mean that watching you become the father Emily needed has made me remember why I fell in love with you in the first place. Catherine, I'm not saying anything needs to change. I'm just acknowledging that my feelings have evolved beyond co-parenting cooperation. Richard felt his heart racing. Mine have too. They sat in silence for several minutes, both processing the admission that their careful boundaries might be shifting. Are we crazy to even consider this? Catherine asked. We failed so spectacularly the first time. We're different people now. I'm different. You're different. Maybe we could be different together. Or maybe we'd fall back into the same patterns that destroyed us before. What patterns? Catherine considered the question seriously. You trying to control everything, me feeling diminished by your need for dominance, both of us prioritizing pride over communication. Do you see those patterns now? Catherine thought about their interactions over the past year, how Richard had deferred to her expertise with Emily, how he had listened to her concerns without defensiveness, how he had consistently put their family's needs above his own preferences. Not anymore. But sustained change is different from crisis change. It's easy to be your best self when everyone is watching and the stakes are obvious. It's harder to maintain that growth through ordinary, daily life. So how do we test whether the changes are real? I don't know. Maybe we don't test them. Maybe we just see what develops naturally. That conversation marked the beginning of a subtle shift in their relationship. They began spending more time together as a family unit, sharing meals regularly, attending Emily's activities together, and gradually rebuilding the emotional intimacy that had once connected them. The changes were small, but significant. Richard began staying for dinner most evenings instead of leaving after Emily's bedtime routine. Catherine started asking his opinion about decisions beyond Emily's immediate needs. They began talking about their work, their goals, their fears and hopes for the future. I'm thinking about running for city council, Catherine told Richard, one evening, as they cleaned up after Emily's birthday party, to change policy around homelessness, to change policy around everything, housing, healthcare access, educational equity, all the systems that failed us and continue to fail other families. Richard felt a surge of pride in Catherine's ambition and vision. You'd be incredible at that. You think so? I know so. You understand these issues from personal experience. You have the professional background to develop effective solutions, and you have the passion to fight for change, even when it's difficult. Catherine was surprised by the depth of Richard's support. During their marriage, he had often been threatened by her professional ambitions, viewing them as competition for her attention and energy. You wouldn't mind being married to a politician? She asked, then immediately blushed at the implication of her words. Are we talking about getting married again? Richard asked gently. I don't know. Maybe, eventually. If we can figure out how to do it right this time. What would doing it right look like? Catherine thought for a moment. Equal partnership, shared decision-making, supporting each other's goals instead of competing with them, choosing love over pride when conflicts arise, and trusting each other enough to be vulnerable instead of defensive. Do you think we could do that? Richard looked around their home. Emily's artwork on the refrigerator, family photos on the mantel, the comfortable chaos of shared domestic life, and felt something he had never experienced during their first marriage. Peace. I think we're already doing it. 6 months later, Richard proposed to Catherine in the most appropriate possible setting, Emily's preschool graduation, surrounded by the community of families who had watched them rebuild their relationship. Catherine Morrison, Richard said, kneeling in front of her while Emily beamed with excitement, will you marry me again? Not because we're perfect, but because we've learned how to love each other better. Are you sure you want to marry someone who's going to run for office and have opinions about everything?" Catherine asked through tears. "I'm sure I want to marry someone who makes me want to be worthy of her love every single day." Catherine looked at Emily, who was practically vibrating with anticipation, then at Richard, who was offering not just a ring, but a promise of continued growth and partnership. "Yes," she said, "but this time we're writing our own vows." 3 years later, Richard and Catherine stood together at another preschool graduation, this time for their son James, born 2 years after their second wedding. Emily, now 6 and a kindergarten graduate herself, served as the proud big sister who helped with everything from diaper changes to bedtime stories. Their second marriage had been everything their first marriage hadn't been, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and the wisdom that comes from having survived failure and chosen growth over pride. Catherine's political career had flourished with Richard's support. As a city councilwoman, she had championed legislation that created affordable housing, expanded healthcare access, and reformed social services to be more responsive to families in crisis. Her personal experience with homelessness and poverty made her a powerful advocate for systemic change. Richard had restructured his business to align with his family values, focusing on sustainable technology solutions rather than pure profit maximization. His company had become a model for corporate responsibility, proving that businesses could be both profitable and ethical. But their greatest achievement was the family they had built together, a family that honored their difficult history while creating new traditions based on love, communication, and shared commitment to growth. "Do you remember," Catherine asked Richard, as they watched James receive his preschool diploma, "when Emily asked me why we didn't sleep in the same room?" That was the beginning, wasn't it? The beginning of admitting we might want to try again. "Are you glad we did?" Richard looked around at their life, Emily excitedly planning her next science project, James clapping enthusiastically for his classmates, Catherine glowing with pride in their children and her own accomplishments. "I'm glad we learned how to fail better," Richard said. "Our first marriage failed because we couldn't handle conflict, couldn't communicate through differences, couldn't choose love over ego. This marriage works because we learned how to fight fairly, apologize genuinely, and prioritize our relationship, even when it's difficult. And because we learned that love isn't a feeling, it's a choice we make every day." That evening, as they tucked both children into bed, Emily asked the question that had become her bedtime ritual. "Tell me again how you and Daddy Richard found each other again." Catherine and Richard exchanged glances, still amazed by their journey from divorce court to this moment of domestic bliss. "Well," Catherine began, "once upon a time, Mommy and Daddy Richard made some mistakes that hurt each other very much. And we both let pride and fear keep us apart when we should have been together," Richard continued. "But then Daddy Richard saw Mommy and Emily on the street and remembered that love is more important than being right. And Mommy forgave Daddy, Richard, and gave him a chance to learn how to be a better husband and father. And then James came along to make our family complete," Emily added, having heard this story dozens of times. "And then we all lived happily ever after?" James asked in his 3-year-old voice. "We're living happily ever after right now," Catherine said, kissing both children goodnight. After the children were asleep, Richard and Catherine sat together on their back deck, watching the stars and marveling at the life they had built from the ashes of their shared mistakes. "Do you think Emily will remember the time before?" Catherine asked. "When we were homeless?" "I hope she remembers that. Difficult times don't last forever if you don't give up on love. And I hope she remembers that families can be broken and repaired, that forgiveness is possible even after terrible hurt." "What do you hope James remembers?" "That he was born into a family that chose each other twice, that fought for each other even when it would have been easier to give up," Richard pulled Catherine closer, still amazed that he got to hold her again, to share a life with her, to wake up every morning knowing they were building something beautiful together. "I love you, Catherine Thornfield," he said, using her married name with the pride of someone who had earned the right to it. "I love you too, Richard Thornfield. Thank you for becoming the man I always believed you could be." Sometimes we need to lose everything to discover what really matters. True love can survive even our biggest mistakes, but only if we're brave enough to change and humble enough to forgive. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel for more narratives about the power of forgiveness and second chances. 5 years later, when Emily was in 4th grade and studying family history for a school project, she interviewed both parents about their love story. "Why did you get divorced the first time?" Emily asked with the directness that characterized all her interactions. "Because we didn't know how to love each other properly yet," Catherine explained. "We let pride and fear make our decisions instead of love and wisdom." "But you learned how." "We learned by making mistakes, by being apart and realizing what we had lost, and by deciding that being together was worth the hard work of changing ourselves." "What's the most important thing about being married?" Emily asked Richard. "Choosing to love your person even when they're difficult, even when you disagree, even when it would be easier to walk away." "And what's the most important thing about being a family?" Richard and Catherine looked at each other, then at their children, then at the life they had built together through failure, forgiveness, and the daily choice to keep growing. "The most important thing," Catherine said, "is knowing that love can survive anything if both people are willing to fight for it." Years later, when Emily and James were adults with families of their own, they would tell their children about grandparents who had loved each other enough to divorce when they were broken, wise enough to change during their separation, and brave enough to try again when they were ready. Their story became family legend, proof that second chances are possible, that people can change, that love is stronger than pride, and that the most beautiful families sometimes grow from the most painful beginnings. Richard and Catherine's love story proved that recognition can come in the most unexpected moments, that redemption is always possible for those willing to do the work, and that sometimes the best thing you can do for someone you love is to become worthy of loving them. The man who had built an empire on control and emotional distance learned to build a family on vulnerability and service. The woman who had lost everything, including her dignity, learned that true strength comes from choosing love even after betrayal. And the little girl who had once shared a sandwich on a cold sidewalk grew up knowing that she was the bridge between her parents' broken past and their beautiful future. Proof that love can transform even the most unlikely circumstances into sources of hope for generations to come.